Hey guys, Adam here with AmericanMuscle.com, and today we're taking a closer look at and of course installing the Eibach Pro Kit lowering springs available for the 2015 newer Scat Pack and Hellcat Challengers. We have a 2016 392 Scat Pack in the shop ready for some Eibach springs, and as you can see, it looks really good. We're eliminating a lot of that factory wheel gap, and I gotta say, the Challenger comes with a little more wheel gap than I'd like off the factory line. I personally think this is how the Challenger should come from the factory, but either way, it looks really good. You're getting that aggressive, lowered muscle car stance. But aside from just the good looks, you're also getting a lot of performance benefits as well with some springs. Now, speaking of lowering the vehicle, 1.1 inches in the front, 1.2 inches in the rear is what you can expect, effectively leveling out that vehicle. It does come with a little bit of factory rake off the line here. Your front end is a little bit lower than the rear, so bringing down the front a little bit less than the rear levels things out and gives it a nice, even, aggressive stance. In addition to the aggressive stance, you're also getting a number of performance benefits as well, thanks to the lowered center of gravity on your Scat Pack or your Hellcat. This is going to translate to less body roll on aggressive cornering, reduced squatting on hard accelerations or launches, less nosedive under hard braking or stopping, and an overall stiffer and sportier suspension and handling feel. Now, because these have a progressive spring rate, you can expect a comfortable drive under normal driving conditions, but it will get progressively sportier under heavier load. Hard launches, aggressive cornering, all the things I just mentioned. So progressive spring rates change depending on their driving condition, as opposed to linear, which stays a little bit more predictable like your factory springs. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that later on when we compare the Eibach to the factory options. Now, if you're looking to get this particular drop for your Hellcat or your Scat Pack, you can do so right under the $300 mark, around $290, $291 on the site. Now, Eibach does have a more aggressive drop with their Sportline kit, and there is a number of different options on the site, this one being a little bit more mild of a lowering spring as far as the drop is concerned. The quality of the spring doesn't change, still high tensile steel springs, similar to the OEM quality stuff, and again, we'll take a closer look later on. The install is going to get full 3 out of 3 wrenches on our difficulty meter. It'll take about 3, maybe 4 hours from start to finish, depending on your personal experience. You want to have a wide variety of tools on deck. I'm going to have this car on a lift here, but if you're working on the ground, it can get a little bit more tricky. And of course, I have air tools, which might be different from what you have at home. So it all depends on what tools you have on hand, which will translate to how quickly you can get the job done. If you're not comfortable tackling this yourself, guys, there's no shame handing it over to a professional to get done properly. When you're messing with suspension components, you want to make sure you're getting it right and getting it right the first time. I'm going to take you through every single step of the process, starting with the front here and uninstalling your factory stuff. So what do you say we get to it? Tools used in this install include a cordless impact, 1/2-inch air impact gun, a 3/8 and 1/2-inch ratchet, 13mm deep socket, 15mm deep socket, 15 and 2 18mm 1/2-inch sockets, 18mm 3/8 socket, 21mm deep 1/2-inch socket, and a 13mm swivel socket, variety of extensions, swivel socket, 15, 18, and 21mm wrenches or ratcheting wrenches, flathead screwdriver, 2 bungee cords, pry bar, torque wrench, ball peen hammer. Additional tools include a hydraulic floor jack, jack stands, and a spring compressor. So once you get your wheels off of your Challenger, have it supported up in the air. As you can see, we're using the lift, makes life a little easier, but if you're working on the ground, that's no problem. Just have jack stands supporting the frame rails to make sure your vehicle is properly supported. With all of that out of the way, the first step is to grab a 21mm socket, and I'm gonna use air tools because I also think it makes life a little easier. If you don't have access to these, an impact gun does the trick, but you wanna put it on its strongest mode. Step number 1 is to use your 21mm socket to remove the bolt holding on your sway bar end link to your factory strut. Once you get that popped off, we'll disconnect the sway bar end link, and then I like to put the nut right back on just to make sure we don't lose it. So let's get that disconnected. Now, if you start running into the issue that I'm running into where the bushing is just continually spinning in the sway bar end link, it's gonna make it hard to pop this nut out of place. So what you wanna do is make sure you're gunning this off from this side, but you may need to wedge a pry bar on the other side to keep that from spinning. There really isn't any hook for, a wrench or anything like that. It's just a complete circle, so it makes it a little more difficult. You just want to do whatever you have to do to break this loose. I recommend wedging a pry bar in the outside. All right, so while wedging that pry bar on the other side, we got that to break loose. Pull the sway bar end link out of place. Now, like I said, I like to thread this nut back in just so we know where it is, because that'll get reinstalled once we have our new springs in place. Set that aside. The next step is to disconnect your ABS lines from the brake lines. So this is really just plugged right in. There's a couple of them throughout this line. Just pull them off. We'll reconnect them later, and I'll show you guys why this matters. You want to make sure you're not putting any tension on this once the suspension starts to droop down when we disconnect the upper control arm. So for now, just disconnect that and get it out of the way. The next step here is to put either a pole jack if you're working up in the air, or a floor jack or hydraulic jack underneath the suspension components here, underneath the hub, to support the weight. Reason being is once we disconnect the upper control arm, this is going to want to drop down and forward. We just want to make sure that doesn't happen, so we prop that up. So I'm on a lift, but I'm going to show you guys what it's like to use a jack stand. If you're using a hydraulic jack, it is a little bit easier, but same concept applies. I'm going to put a piece of wood right on top to give it a nice flat, even surface. You're going to put that right past the rotor on the bottom of the hub assembly. Just line that up so that when you lower it, that's what's making contact. The bottom hub bolt will most likely make contact first. So what I'm going to do is basically lower this down onto the wood just enough that it touches, and then just a little bit further past that to put some weight on it. From there, we'll disconnect the upper control arm. Now that we have this supported, what we're going to do is disconnect our upper control arm from the hub assembly. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need an 18mm short socket to get this off. And again, I'm using air tools. If you're not using air tools, it will be a little bit more difficult simply because this is extremely tight and all of the tension between them is, keeping it on, as well as the fact that the bushing in here likes to spin as well. So it can be a tough task, but have some patience. It can be tedious, but you can get that off. One other thing to mention is you may be able to get an Allen key in here if you have ratcheting wrenches or just a regular wrench, an 18mm. That can also work. Again, it'll take a little bit of time, but you can do it. With air tools, I'm going to be gunning this off, but I'm also going to use a pry bar to pry down on the upper control arm. The reason being is we don't want this to jolt off. Once this is disconnected, it may pop completely out. We don't want it to do that. Also, putting pressure on it, pulling down on this, will prevent this from spinning a little bit more than just having it freebird. So now I've got my pry bar on the upper control arm, air tools, trying to get in on that bolt there. All right, with that nut out of the way, you still want to hold pressure on the upper control arm. This is a neat trick that might help you out here. Take that nut and thread it on just 2 threads. Take this out. Now this is stuck, so we have to dislodge the upper control arm. So we're gonna grab a ball peen hammer. We're just gonna tap away at the hub assembly here just to knock this loose. You don't wanna tap on the upper control arm. You don't wanna damage the bushing. Tap here to get it to dislodge. Then we'll pry down, remove it, and disconnect them. All right, so we're gonna tap away just right here, avoiding the bushing. Having this nut here will prevent it from completely disconnecting and dropping forward. Once you have that disconnected, grab your pry bar, pry down using the coil and the spring, remove this, hold the hub assembly back, disconnect. Now what I like to do again, just like we did with our sway bar end link, just thread that nut back on a couple threads. We know where it is, it's not getting lost because that will get reinstalled later. Next step, we're gonna remove the strut bolt on the bottom of our strut, holding it to our lower control arm. Grab an 18mm socket and pull this right off. Now you don't need a wrench on the opposite end because the nut is welded to the strut itself. With that disconnected, you can remove that block from the bottom and let it droop down. Now we're gonna grab a bungee cord to make sure with this entire hub supported and not putting too much pressure on the brake line. Now, as you can see, we're putting a lot of tension and pressure on this brake line here on our hub assembly. So I'm gonna use a bungee cord. If you have a rope or something like that, or even a hanger, that'll do the trick. I'm just gonna use that to prop this back so that we're relieving the tension there. We don't want this to break. So we're gonna hook this around. I'm gonna wrap it around one time, and then just obviously hook it anywhere you want, just not on the strut because we'll be removing that. So there's a couple of holes back here on the frame, on the chassis. I'm gonna hook this back. That way, even just a little bit takes that pressure off, and now we have a little slack here. So that's all we needed to do. At this point, we're gonna go under the hood and remove the 3 top strut tower nuts holding this in place. We'll pull the whole thing out, get to work on our spring compressor. Next up here under the hood is to remove the strut tower cap, which is basically that chrome trim that we have here. It's screwed on, so just lefty-loosey, pop this thing right off. Set that aside. Grab a 13mm socket and remove the 3 nuts holding this in place. Keep in mind that this may shuffle down from the bottom, so it's a good idea to have one hand holding that just to support it. Remove the 3, and then we'll be able to pop this thing out. So we got everything disconnected. It's about time we just remove the strut from the suspension. So we're just gonna push down and get a little flex on the lower control arm. So we're gonna disconnect the bungee cord just for a moment to get a little bit more flex into it. Push down and lift up on the strut just to bring that around the lower control arm. Slide this out of place, set this aside, and let's reconnect that bungee cord. Now we're gonna kick things off for the uninstall of our rear springs. Now in order to do that, I wanna let you know there are a couple of different methods to go about this. I'm gonna show you guys what I find to be the easiest. Keep in mind, no matter what method you take, you're going to need to get an alignment afterwards. So keep that in mind moving forward. Here, what we're gonna do is start by using a hydraulic floor jack to support the weight of the lower control arm right underneath of the spring. And we're gonna unbolt the lower control arm from the subframe at the back. From there, we're gonna lower that hydraulic jack, and it's basically just gonna slowly drop down the lower control arm, taking the compression and the weight and tension off of the spring, allowing us to pull it out, throw our Eibach one in, and just jack that thing right back up, stick the bolt through, and do it in reverse order. Now, one of the other methods that people often use is basically dropping the subframe one piece at a time. You just unbolt it from the chassis, lower it down, pop this out. Now, I just find this to be a whole lot easier. You don't have to worry about lining things back up and using pole jacks and whatnot. I just think this is an easier method, but it's all personal preference. Now, if you're taking it through my way, I'm gonna take you step by step. First thing we're gonna do is take the hydraulic jack. We're gonna put the pad underneath of the lower control arm, right under the spring. Now the next step, while you have this supported, is to get your bottom shock bolt out. It's an 18mm nut on the outside and a 15mm bolt head on the inside. So grab an 18 socket, put it on the nut, and a 15 wrench or socket, put it on the bolt head. All right, for the next bolt here, connecting the lower control arm to the frame, what we're gonna do is use a 15mm wrench for the bolt head and an 18mm ratcheting wrench for the opposite side, for the nut. Now we're gonna be cranking the nut off. You don't wanna be backing the bolt head up just yet. Just back off the nut on the opposite end. It's a really tight spot, so you might not be able to fit a socket and a ratchet, so we're gonna use a ratcheting wrench. As you can see, it's getting to the point where we can't back this bolt up anymore because of the exhaust tailpipe on our driver's side. So what I'm gonna do is actually leave everything as it is right now, head under the car, grab a 13mm socket, and remove the bolt holding this tailpipe up right above the tailpipe tip. That'll give us enough flex in this pipe to just shuffle it out of the way, back the bolt head all the way out, and continue moving forward. All right, right above our tip, you can see this bracket on the hanger is bolted up to the chassis. We're gonna go ahead and back that all the way out. All right, at this point, we can really slowly start to let down on our hydraulic jack. We're gonna slowly let this down. It'll relieve the pressure from the spring and basically just limp right out of place. We'll be able to pull it out. Key word being slowly. Oh. All right, as you can see, the spring came out of place, and now we can pull it off. Make sure when you're pulling the spring out of place, you're taking the isolators with it. All right, so here's the upper isolator. And the lower isolator's coming with it. You wanna make sure you're keeping these because they'll be reused with our new Eibach ones. Now you can repeat for the other side. Now guys, it's time to work on our spring compressor. We still have our factory springs on our Bilstein strut, and we have to get those off in order to get our Eibach one on. So when operating a spring compressor, it goes without saying guys, it can be extremely dangerous. Exercise extreme caution, make sure you're doing it properly. I'm gonna show you a couple of the steps here. We've got a wall mounted compressor, which is a lot easier than a freehand one. If you're working with a freehand one, again, just take extreme caution. So we have our coilover here mounted right up on the bottom coils. You wanna rest these arms flat up on the bottom coil here without coming in contact with the bottom of the seat. Now, the top portion, there's a couple of different ways to skin the cat here. It's all personal preference. I like to put these arms directly on the top of the strut hat. Gives you a flat, solid surface to work with. Most people would go straight to the top coil and condense from there, but I'm going straight to the top hat. We have these arms positioned properly. Now, as you can see, there's a big indent here with a solid surface. You want to make sure that the indent is right on top of the strut hat and the solid surface on the outside of this rim here. Once we have that positioned correctly, we're gonna compress this, bring it down to make sure it's touching, and they all evenly seat on the top hat. Once you have all your safety checks in place, what we're gonna do is continue to compress the spring. The goal here is to basically take the pressure and tension off of the spring in order to safely remove the top hat without the spring decompressing. So we're gonna decompress the spring. All right, at this point we have the tension taken off the spring, 18 socket here, right on top of the nut. All right, let's get this out of the way. Now we can slowly decompress the spring. Slowly is the key word here, guys. You don't want to shoot this thing off. And again, we're working on the wall-mounted one, but if you're working freehand, just be really careful. It's under a lot of tension and pressure. Once we're off, I like to put a stool underneath it so it doesn't fall straight out. Once you have this out of the way, move these arms back, lift the whole thing out, take the strut hat right off with the boot, spring comes out, we can set this aside. So we finally got all of our springs off of the 16 Challenger behind me and on the table, and I just wanted to give you guys a quick side-by-side comparison between the Eibach and our stock springs. We've got our front springs over here and our rears here. I've got one of each on the table to give you that side-by-side. Now the biggest thing I want to point out here is the drop. Now I know we talked about that earlier on, but keep in mind the front end dropping 1.1 inches and the rear again 1.2 inches. So a relatively mild drop, but we know that these cars come with a pretty big wheel gap from the factory. So I'm expecting this to do a ton of good as far as appearance and especially when it comes to your handling and suspension components. Now another big change comes in with the spring rate. Now the factory springs are linear and your new Eibach springs are progressive. Now if you guys aren't familiar with the terminology, linear springs are going to be a lot more predictable off the line. These things are going to keep their spring rate consistent no matter what the driving condition, whether it be in traffic on the highway or if you're at the drag strip doing a hard launch. Now those springs stay consistent and they're very predictable. The thing about linear springs is they're not always the best on roll control. So going around corners at higher end speeds, linear springs aren't typically the better choice there. Now progressive springs typically stay pretty comfortable under normal driving conditions, but under heavier load, like doing burnouts, hard launches on the strip, or quick takeoffs, these things definitely stiffen up and get a lot sportier and tighter, keeping more control, reducing a lot more body roll, nosedive, and excessive squatting on braking. So progressive springs are gonna have that sportier feel. They change depending on your driving conditions and how hard your launches are and the different loads being put on them. And you can clearly see the difference, especially when it comes to the rear springs. Now here, I'm gonna pop off our factory isolators. The factory rear springs look like this. That's a linear spring, even gaps among each of the coils. This is your progressive spring from Eibach. You can see at the top end here, they're a lot tighter wound together with bigger gaps at the bottom end. That is a clear indication of a progressive spring. Now, the other big difference here, and I know it doesn't make any difference to performance, but it's worth noting, your Eibach springs are coated in red, factory springs are coated in black. The red is a pretty good indication of an Eibach spring. As far as the quality of materials, it's all pretty much OEM quality, the same materials as you can expect with your factory springs, high tensile steel, and really the quality is gonna be there. It all depends on the spring rate. That's gonna really change the performance and feel of the car, and going from your linear to progressive with the Eibach, with the 1.1 in the front, 1.2 in the rear, you're definitely gonna feel a sportier ride and one that's more controlled. With all of that out of the way, the last thing I wanna point out here is your isolators. Now, because we're working on a 2016, our isolators are looking pretty dang new, so we're not gonna need replacements, but if yours are looking worse for wear, you might wanna pick them up now while everything's uninstalled. No sense putting everything back together with the crappy isolators just to find out that they're breaking and you need new ones anyway, and then having to redo all of it. If your isolators are looking worse for wear, just pick up some new ones. You can get them at your local auto parts store, order them online, whatever the case may be. be and install those while you're doing this job. Now ours are looking pretty good, so we're gonna reuse them, but keep in mind none of them are included in the kit. So we're gonna transfer those over to our new springs and get to work on the install, starting at the front. All right guys, we're back here at our spring compressor because we're gonna start our install at the front end of the vehicle, which means we have to reinstall our new Eibach springs onto our factory Bilstein struts. In order to do that, we mounted our spring onto the compressor here with the strut placed through the bottom of it. We're gonna take our top strut hat and do the same thing we did taking it off, just in reverse order. We're gonna drop our strut hat right through the middle here, and you wanna take note of the end coil at the top and the end coil at the bottom, because they do have a seat or a wall that they're gonna push up against for the isolator. So when they drop into place here, you're basically gonna rotate this to make sure that wall seats up against the end of the spring, both at the top and bottom. You can see it down here seating up against that isolator. Now what we're gonna do is make sure that this can safely compress up against the top of the hat like we did in the beginning. Now the goal here to reinstall our spring is to basically get just enough thread through the top that we can put the nut on, we can gun it on from there and torque it down. You don't have to compress it too much, just enough to get the threads through. All right, so we got enough thread definitely from the top, just making sure that the springs are still seated properly at the top and bottom, which they are. Grab the factory nut, just thread it on by hand up here. Grab your 18 socket and gun it on. Once that's torqued, the last step is our factory spacer, or the washer. That goes right on top. Make sure that the spring is still seated properly and decompress. Once it's decompressed, you won't have any play in where the spring seats on the isolator, so you want to do that while it is still compressed. Slide those out of the way, pull it out. We're good to do the same thing for the other one. All right, first step of the reinstallation here is to grab your driver's side strut. Now, we're gonna indicate our driver's side because the welded on nut here is gonna be facing the front of the vehicle. We're gonna go ahead and slip this into place. Once you have it lined up top, we'll try to line up your bottom half of the strut over the bolt holes. Doesn't have to be perfect just yet, but just get it nice and lined up. From here, pull the studs up through the top a little bit, and we're basically just gonna lightly tighten down these 13mm nuts just by hand to get it to hold itself in place. We don't want to tighten it down too much just yet. It's all personal preference, but I find it to be easier just to put the nuts in place to hold the strut up while we work down low. And the last thing we'll do for the assembly is tighten it all down up here. All right, the next step here is to line up the bottom of our strut with the holes in the lower control arm, which may require you to just give a little play in the suspension to line those bolt holes up. Once you got them lined up, grab your 18mm bolt and put it through. Start that threading by hand to make sure it catches. You'll feel it go all the way through and catch. Grab an 18 socket and tighten that down. Next step is our upper control arm here. Now, as you remember, we have this bungee cord, so we're gonna have to remove that. Now, you might find it easier to do what we did in the beginning by putting like a jack stand or a hydraulic jack and pushing up on the suspension to line it up, but I don't think we're gonna need that here. We're just gonna basically take this nut out of place, line these two up. You might have to adjust the position and the angle of that control arm. Drop it down into place, and we're gonna thread that nut back through. All right, so we got these connected. I'm gonna go up as high as I can by hand. So that's in place. Grab an 18 socket and tighten this down. Next step is our sway bar end link. Now, if you remember, I put our nut right back on the stud. Just get that off. Line that up with the back mounting position on your strut and tighten the nut down from the back end. Grab a 21mm socket and tighten that down. All right, the next step here down low is to reconnect our ABS lines. Now, if you remember, they just pop right into these plastic clips. There's one on the frame, and there's 3 of them on your brake line. All right, the last step for our driver's side here is to tighten up these 3 nuts, and we'll put that cat back on. Grab your billet cap, just thread it back in, get it nice and hand tight, and you can repeat for the other side. All right, once your whole suspension at the front end is dialed in, you want to grab a torque wrench and torque down a few things. So we're going to tackle our sway bar end link, we're going to tackle the bottom strut bolt, and we're going to tackle the upper control arm. Now, the upper control arm bushing we've already done. This is 35 foot-pounds plus a 90-degree turn. Your sway bar end link, you're going to do 74 foot-pounds. So that's what we're going to do next. We've got our torque wrench here and a 21mm half-inch socket on the end here. Set your torque wrench to 74 foot-pounds. Set that into place. And tighten it down until you hear the click. We're going to turn this up to 128 foot-pounds, and we're going to do the bottom strut bolt connecting it to the lower control arm. All right, switch over to an 18 socket. So what do you say we start the install on the rear? Now, before we get started, I want to point one thing out. For our uninstall, if you remember, it was a struggle getting that bolt out that holds the lower control arm to the frame, simply because the exhaust tailpipe is in the way on our driver's side. So in order to remedy that situation, we basically loosened up the clamp holding the exhaust pipe next to the actuator for our active exhaust. So that'll be right under your axle shaft. Loosen that up and you can just drop the entire tailpipe downward a little bit after unbolting the tailpipe tip, if you remember that as well. So with that rotated out of the way, we have a clear access point. That'll give us a little bit more of a headache-free install, putting our new Eibach springs into place. Next step here, install your lower isolator. Now this isn't gonna get installed to the spring directly, it's gonna get installed to the lower control arm. Now, as you can see, it is a very specific shape. It has a notch up at the top. That has a specific point that you're gonna install it in, right on that lower control arm pocket. You'll see, it only rotates in one way. So we're gonna drop that into place, get that down, and you'll know because you can't twist it. It sits right in a very specific order. So with that out of the way, you can grab our spring, and you're gonna install this with the tightly wound coils at the top and the spaced out coils at the bottom. The Eibach logo should be legible. So as you can see, we can read it just like that. The top isolator, if you remember, just like our spring compressor situation, is gonna seat properly as well. You can see it's got this opening, then the lip, that's got a wall it's gonna seat into. Rotate this in, and it stops. That's how you're gonna wanna install that. So that'll go right on the top. On the bottom, same case. On the end, that'll have a seat on that lower isolator we just installed. So let's get it in there. All right, now we can insert our spring, making sure the bottom coil seats where we want it to. Gonna rotate that so you can see the bottom coil line up with its wall that it needs to sit against. Once that's in place, we can use our floor jack to pump this up into place. All right, now pumping up the lower control arm with our floor jack here, the key is to keep an eye on this bolt hole on our lower control arm, getting that to line up with the bolt hole on our frame. Now, it can be a little tricky. It might take a little trial and error, repositioning your jack, making sure it's leveled. Once you have it lined up, we'll slip the bolt hole in, hammer it into place, and then do our bottom shock bolt. All right, once you get that bolt hole lined up, grab your bolt, your stock bolt, set it into place. You may need to use a hammer to tap it back in. All right, with the bolt all the way through to the other side, grab your 18mm nut, thread it on by hand, grab an 18 wrench or socket on this side, and your 15 socket on the opposite side, and it'll pull through when you gun it on. Now for the next step, we're gonna attach our shock bolt to the bottom of the shock to the lower control arm. Now, the trick to getting these holes to line up is to take a flathead screwdriver and insert it into the opposite end where the bolt end would come out of. From there, you can actually just pry up from the inside and line up those bolt holes. You can kind of manipulate the shock that way from the opposite side insert your bolt in. Just hammer it through, grab your nut, hand tighten it on the opposite side, and grab an 18 and a 15 and tighten them down. Now with them tightened up, you can lower your floor jack. All right, the last step of the driver's side of our rear end is to reassemble our exhaust pipe. So we're just gonna rotate this back up into position. Use our 13 bolt to tighten this back down to the frame. At this point, just repeat for the other side of your rear end and you'll be good to go. Well guys, that's gonna wrap up my quick overview and install for the Eibach Pro Kit lowering springs available for the 15 and newer Scat Pack and Hellcat Challengers. You can pick your setup right here at AmericanMuscle.com.